Hello. I'm Federico. So extinction. When I think about extinction, the first thing that comes to mind is death. But actually, the two things are very, very different. Death and extinction are two completely different things. That's because they are predicates of completely different subjects. Death is something that has to do with me, with you. I will die, you will die. But we will not go extinct. Extinction has to do with abstract concepts. Death has to do with individual singularities. Extinction has to do with linguistic units. An animal species will die by its individual members. An animal species will go extinct, but its individual members will only merely die. Extinction thus has something to do with abstraction, the construction of linguistic constructs. And because of this connection with linguistic constructs, I thought that the best way to look at extinction is to look at the word extinction, to begin with that. When we look at extinction, we look at a word that comes from Latin, extinguere, where ex means off, extinguere is to quench, to smother. Stinguere, in turn, comes from a very, very ancient Indo-European root, which is stig, which means to poke, to stab, to penetrate. Stig is a root that is present in many European words, not only in extinction, but in others, for example, distinction, instigation, instinct. And so the way we'll talk today is by following the root stig. By following the root stig through four passages, the four passages of a pharmakon, that is, of something that is at the same time an attempt to identify the poison and to find a remedy to it. And these four steps are extinction, instigation, distinction, and instinct. Extinction first. Well, we said extinction relates to linguistic categories. It's something that only affects linguistic constructs. So the fact that our world today is obsessed and is faced by a catastrophic crisis of extinction that has to do not only with the political and economic situation of the world, but with the ontology of our world, with the way in which our world is composed. Our world is susceptible to extinction and not to death. We're worried about extinction, not about death. Because our world is increasingly constituted not by living organisms, not by singularities, but by linguistic constructs. How did this happen? How did the world become suddenly void of life and filled only with names? Well, this is a tendency that was always present in the medieval theocracies or in the scientism of the Enlightenment and so on. But recently, it has taken on a much different, much more all-encompassing character. We can trace this latest deepening of the linguistic turn of the world, first to the time that followed Nietzsche's intuition of the coming times of nihilism, a time in which it seemed that the sky had cleared of old values, old gods, and then at the same time, very quickly, it was filled again with new clouds and new gods. And the first that understood the name of the new gods were people like Ernst Jünger or Martin Heidegger, and they called them Technik. But Technik was not simply technology, scientific thoughts. Technik was something much bigger. It was, in Jünger's words, the total mobilization of the world, according to a point of view which saw the world only as a stockpiling of standing reserves, said Heidegger. Standing reserve which is ready to be employed, to be exploited, and to be put to production for the only interest of Technik's own reproduction. So at the time of Jünger and Heidegger, this turn had the aspect of a very intensive industrialist turn. Everything turned into a natural resource, ready to be put to work in a factory. Everything became a productive value, more or less replaceable, more or less dispensable. But it's only in recent years, with the so-called post-Fordist turn, with what Bifo calls semio-capitalism, that this process of the linguistic turn became absolutely clear and very dramatic. Everything became suddenly explicitly translated into language, not just abstractly into values of production, but literally into units of language. Let's think of the language of finance, or the language of information technology, of cognitive work. The world was translated into language, and everything which exceeded it was erased. We can see something like that to do with extinction and with death. When we look at, for example, our relationship with pain, the medicalization of pain, something that Salvatore Natoli, for example, the Italian philosopher, wrote much about in the 1980s, is a clear sign of how suddenly death disappeared and extinction took center place. Death becomes something monstrous, something absurd, and whoever commits killing, produces death, is necessarily a monster. And whoever sustains death is necessarily a hero. Look at the media. The new way in which we talk about heroes today is simply anybody who suffers death, regardless of any positive action they have ever done. And conversely, extinction becomes the fundamental way of understanding the passing of time, the moving of geological eras. And for example, if you look at the statistical element of mass slaughters in the 20th century, we understand that the statistical element is not a monstrosity, but in fact is a norm, is necessary for an era which understands things only as linguistic, measurable units. But when we think about this world, this absolutely linguistic world, we look at a sphere, you look at a place which is completely, fully closed onto itself. It's a world that has renounced at the same time to heaven and to earth. It floats in a limbo populated by eye clouds. And it's a world, most importantly, that has no outside. There is no outside to language. All that can be said is all that there is. All that cannot be said isn't. This is, by definition, the most annihilating form of nihilism. This is the world of extinction, but it's not all. There is instigation. The second part, stig, returns. But stig returns not aimed at linguistic categories, but returns as aimed to us as individuals, instigation, something that has to do with us. And in fact, if we look back, for example, of Hermes Trismegistus, the great Hermetic thinker, he used to say, as it is above, so it is below, as it isn't this big, so it isn't this small. And in fact, what affects the macrocosm is often what affects the microcosm. And the changes in the macrocosm are the changes in the microcosm. And that means that also we, not only the world, have become increasingly without an outside, increasingly reduced to what can be said of us, increasingly reduced to become data, to be fed into a predictive algorithm of the police or of a financial bank, or increasingly reduced to identify ourselves completely with our communicable performative identities. And inserted as we are in this absolutely total world of language without an outside, we indeed lack a place outside of it from which we can exert any will or any form of autonomy. We're entirely paralyzed. This feeling of paralysis is usually called anxiety, but we should actually call epiphany. Anxiety is epiphany today. Anxiety is the revelation of two things especially. At the first time firstly, anxiety is the revelation of a situation of complete closure, of a situation in which we are spoken by language, we are acted upon by action, we are forced to hyperactivity, and yet we cannot speak, we cannot act. And secondly, most importantly, anxiety. Anxiety has a mysterious origin. You can never quite locate it. Where does anxiety come from? Well, it comes from an outside. Anxiety is the first symptom of the existence of an outside. But what is this outside, this place that exceeds language? But that exceeds it without being mere emptiness, and that's important. It's a place to which death, not extinction, leads. Extinction leads to nothingness, to the void. Death leads to the outside. But it's also the place from which action originates, the emanating source of action and language, like the empty space in our throat that produces sound. Many have called it in different ways. Plotinus, for example, used to call it the one, the good, everything from the thing beyond definition from which everything emanates. In the macrocosm, there was this definition. In the microcosm, Max Stirner used to call it the creative nothing, the nothing that creates everything. He used to call it the ego, the creative nothing. I personally want to call it singularity, not the technological singularity, another singularity, a place from which autonomy autonomy can finally take place. Third, distinction. Anxiety induces a paralysis, and is a discomforting state, a state of painful alertness, a shrieking dissonance, and forces us to move out. It forces us to break the fraudulent unity, the all-encompassing fragmentation of language, and to seek something else, to seek an outside, a point outside of it from which to move. That is, in contemporary words, it instigates a crisis. But what is crisis? Well, in Greek, it comes from krinein, which means to judge, to make distinctions. And that's what crisis is, the state in which you make distinctions, the state in which you judge. And the fundamental distinction the crisis forces us to make is the separation between what enters language, what is within language, and what is outside of it. This is a challenge to semio-capitalism and also to a squalid form of materialism. By recognizing that language does not encompass all, that there is something beyond it, that we are not simply what can be said of us, that things are not simply the biological categories, we circumscribe language, so we limit it, but by limiting it, because language is also the only way in which we can act in the world, we also circumscribe our possibilities of action. We limit it, we shape it, we understand its reach, and thus we make it possible. By finding an outside to language, we make language possible. By finding an outside to action, we make action possible. So, although we cannot talk about the singularity, because it's by definition beyond language, we cannot talk about this outside. We can still hint towards it. In ancient times, they would have done it with metaphors or symbols. I refer to it as singularity, but as I said, Plotinus deferred it in other ways. And another way of looking at it is by looking, for example, at how Emmanuel Levinas and Simon Critchley talk of this outside that we find in things, that we find in ourselves as the other as God. This something, this psyche in Greek, psyche, the breath, the thing that you cannot see and yet animates. So this look at singularity. It's not simply a philosophical exercise, but it's also a possibility of moving outside of language and then from this outside, moving back in, re-approaching language, re-entering it as if from an outside, re-entering with, what's most important, a skeptical lightheartedness, understanding the world of language, the world of identities, the world of numbers, the world of names, of politics, of finance, for what it is, a game. Baltasar Gracian, Calderón de la Barca used to call it a play. You know, the world is a stage, the play, which is something that you do, but something in which you do not believe. So this crisis judgment that I'm talking about, which we insert into the world of language, is shrewd in its practice because it manipulates language rather than being manipulated by it. And this is a political element. It's ethical in its structure because it seeks the good of the subjectivity, of the singularity, rather than that of the reproduction of the language system itself. Think, for example, of finance. And most importantly, is aesthetic in its origin. Aesthetic means that it's a form of judgment, it's a form of crisis that comes from before language, goes through language filled with doubt, and then goes beyond language and touches in the object which it looks, that element which is beyond language. That element that I call singularity, in ancient times would have been called the sacred, something which in ancient times would have been called the miraculous, as in the relationship of a singularity to a singularity through language, which exceeds language, which today we can call the relationship from a lover to a lover. That's the relationship that we can aspire to. And this leads us to 4, instinct, which is the last stop of this pharmaceutical journey. The stig is still there, stig. It's still within us, but it no longer pushes us forward towards anything. It returns and it stays within us all the time for what it is. It's death. And death, from our limited perspective, from our language perspective, can never be described. It can only be described as mortality, That's how we can call it. Mortality is a symptom of our existential limits and thus of our field of action, but it's also the symptom of our singularity, death and singularity. We die as singularities, never as linguistic units. And when we die, we leave the field of language and we go to whatever exceeds it. So mortality's action, the awareness of mortality, is very complex, but mainly has two effects on us. First of all, it is an example of how we can relate to singularity, how we can relate to an outside to language. Mortality is something that we can never know, something we are always aware of. It is something of which we have an aesthetic understanding. And on the other, it defines our position in the world. Mortality says that we are powerful within our mortal limits, that is, within language. And at the same time, we always remain the bearers of something over which we have no power, but which is the origin of our power. So mortality at once defines, limits, and enhances our power in the world of language. It is the primary symptom of our singularity, and it is the origin of our autonomy, as it shapes and limits and enhances our action in the world. It is the cipher that orders our existence. It is, in ancient terms, the beautiful form, the beautiful number of our existence. It's something that we should not try obsessively to overstretch through medicalization or try to deny by losing ourselves into the false promises of immortality, of language, glory, a career, identity, the bright sun of the future. But what is most important, that mortality hints towards the fundamental ethical goal, which is the fundamental ethical goal which is together with death and against extinction, and it is that of inhabiting the world. Inhabiting rather than conquering the world or being conquered by it, which are the alternatives offered by technique, and rather than denying it, rejecting it altogether, which are the alternatives offered by primitivism and Luddism. So to conclude, it was famously said, first by Cicero, then Montaigne, that philosophy is the art of learning how to die. But I think that, especially in this context, we could say that philosophy is rather the art of learning how to live as mortals. This means how to inhabit the world as entities that are forever always accompanied by an unfathomable presence, the presence of our own singularity, that is the presence of our own death. So getting acquainted with singularity, our own or that of others, that is, getting acquainted with death, our own and that of others, is a crucial step to be able to gain existential autonomy, to reclaim the possibility of aesthetic judgment, to lightheartedly submit language to ethics, and thus, ultimately, to develop an existential and political strategy which is capable of defeating extinction. Thanks.